The thunder cracked like gunfire across the darkened sky as Margaret Whitlow pressed her weathered hands against the kitchen window, watching the rain slash sideways through the cornfields. What she didn't know was that this storm would bring her a stranger whose life would intertwine with hers in ways that would echo through decades. 20 years later, a knock on her door would prove that sometimes the most profound acts of kindness plant seeds that bloom when we least expect them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Part 1. The autumn storm of 1983 had been building for hours, and Margaret Whitlow could feel it in her bones. At 42, she had weathered enough Nebraska storms to know when nature was preparing something fierce. The wind howled through the gaps in their old farmhouse, making the wooden beams creak like old joints. Her husband Samuel was in the barn, checking on their 3 dairy cows and the handful of chickens they kept for eggs. Their own children, twin boys named Jacob and Joshua, were upstairs doing homework by lamplight, the electricity having flickered out an hour ago. Margaret stirred the pot of vegetable soup simmering on their wood-burning stove, the aroma of carrots, potatoes, and the last of their summer beans filling the modest kitchen. Their farm wasn't much to look at: 60 acres of corn and soybeans, a small vegetable garden, and livestock that barely kept them afloat, but it was theirs. Every morning, Margaret woke before dawn to milk the cows, tend the garden, and prepare meals that stretched their meager budget. Every evening, she mended clothes by candlelight and counted pennies to make sure they could afford seed for next season. The storm had been raging for 3 hours when Margaret heard something that made her pause mid-stir. Through the howling wind and driving rain, she could swear she heard the desperate honking of a car horn. She set down her wooden spoon and pressed her ear closer to the window. There it was again, sharp, urgent, cutting through the storm like a cry for help. Without hesitation, Margaret grabbed her rain slicker from the hook by the door and stepped out into the maelstrom. The wind immediately tried to knock her sideways, and the rain stung her face like tiny needles. She could barely see 10 feet in front of her, but she followed the sound of the horn down their gravel driveway toward the main road. What she found made her heart leap into her throat. A sleek black sedan had skidded off the road and was tilted at a dangerous angle in the drainage ditch, its front end buried in mud and standing water. The headlights were still on, cutting pale beams through the rain, and someone inside was frantically pressing the horn. Margaret slipped and slid down the embankment, her boots squelching in the thick mud. She could see 2 figures in the car: a man in an expensive suit slumped over the steering wheel, unconscious, and in the passenger seat, a woman in an elegant dress who was very clearly in labor. The woman's face was contorted with pain, her hands gripping the dashboard as another contraction racked her body. When she saw Margaret's face appear at the passenger window, her eyes filled with desperate relief. "Please," the woman gasped as Margaret managed to wrench open the door. "The baby, it's coming now. We were trying to get to the hospital in Lincoln, but the storm." Another contraction cut off her words, and she cried out in agony. Margaret didn't hesitate. "What's your name, honey?" "Victoria," the woman panted. "Victoria Ashford. My husband is Richard. He hit his head when we went off the road. I think he's unconscious." Margaret quickly assessed the situation. The man was breathing but unresponsive, likely with a concussion. The car was stuck fast in the mud, and with the storm raging, no emergency vehicles would be able to reach them for hours. The nearest hospital was 30 miles away in Lincoln, and the back roads were probably flooded by now. "Victoria, listen to me," Margaret said, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. "I'm Margaret Whitlow. I've delivered babies before, helped birth my own twins, and assisted with several of our neighbors' children. We need to get you somewhere safe and warm. Can you move?" Victoria nodded weakly. "I think so. But the contractions, they're so close together." Margaret had delivered enough calves and foals on their farm to know that this baby wasn't going to wait. She also knew from her experience with human births that Victoria was in the final stages of labor. They had minutes, not ours. We're going to take this one step at a time, Margaret said, positioning herself to help Victoria out of the car. My farmhouse is just up that hill. Samuel, my husband, can help us with your husband afterward. The journey from the car to the farmhouse was treacherous. Margaret supported Victoria's weight as they climbed out of the ditch, both women slipping and sliding in the mud. The rain soaked through their clothes within seconds, and Victoria had to stop twice as powerful contractions doubled her over. Margaret found herself praying to a God she'd only spoken to on Sundays, asking for strength and guidance. By the time they reached the farmhouse, Victoria's water had broken, and Margaret knew they had no time to waste. She kicked open the door and called upstairs to her boys. Jacob, Joshua, I need you boys to come down here right now and help me. The twins, both 14 years old and accustomed to farm emergencies, appeared at the top of the stairs. Their eyes widened when they saw their mother supporting an elegant stranger who was clearly in distress. There's been an accident, Margaret explained quickly. This lady is having a baby, and we need to help her. Joshua, I need you to run to the barn and get your father. Tell him there's an injured man in a car in the ditch. Jacob, get me every clean towel and sheet we have and start heating water. On the stove, the boys jumped into action without question. Farm life had taught them to respond quickly to emergencies, whether it was a sick animal or a sudden storm. As Joshua ran out into the rain toward the barn, Jacob began gathering supplies. Margaret helped Victoria into the small downstairs bedroom that served as a guest room during harvest season when Samuel's brother sometimes stayed over. The room was simple but clean, with a handmade quilt covering the narrow bed and a washstand in the corner. Victoria, how far apart are your contractions? Margaret asked as she helped the younger woman out of her soaked dress. Maybe 2 minutes, Victoria gasped. Maybe less. I can feel the baby. I think it's coming. Margaret had delivered her own twins in this very room 28 years ago when a blizzard had prevented them from reaching the doctor in town. She knew what needed to be done, but she also knew that childbirth always carried risks, especially in circumstances like these. Jacob appeared with an armload of clean linens. Ma, the water's heating up. Should I bring it in here? Not yet, son. First, help me get some pillows to prop Mrs. Ashford up. Margaret turned to Victoria. I know this is frightening, but I want you to know that you're in good hands. I've been present for many births, and every one of them has been a miracle. Victoria grabbed Margaret's hand with surprising strength. I'm scared, she whispered. This is my first child. Richard and I tried for so long, and when we finally, another contraction cut her off, this one so intense that she couldn't speak for nearly a minute. Margaret checked Victoria's progress and realized that the baby was indeed coming immediately. Victoria, on the next contraction, I need you to push. Can you do that for me? The next hour was a blur of intensity, pain, and ultimately, profound joy. Margaret coached Victoria through each contraction, her own hands steady despite the magnitude of what was happening. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the small bedroom, all of Margaret's focus was on safely bringing this child into the world. Samuel appeared in the
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
doorway at one point, rain dripping from his coat. Margaret, the man in the car is conscious now, but he's got a nasty bump on his head. I helped him up to the house. He's in the kitchen, worried sick about his wife. Tell him she's doing beautifully, Margaret called back, not taking her eyes off Victoria. And Samuel, see if you can get the radio working. We should try to get word to the hospital about what's happening. As if responding to the urgency in the room, Victoria's contractions intensified, and Margaret could see the crown of the baby's head. That's it, Victoria. I can see the baby. One more big push. With a final, tremendous effort, Victoria pushed, and suddenly Margaret was holding a tiny, slippery, perfect human being. The baby's cry pierced the air, strong and clear, competing with the thunder outside. It's a boy, Margaret announced, tears streaming down her face as she quickly cleared the baby's airway and wrapped him in a clean towel. A beautiful, healthy boy. Victoria collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted but radiant. Is he really okay? Margaret placed the baby in Victoria's arms, and the transformation on the younger woman's face was something Margaret would remember for the rest of her life. All the pain, fear, and uncertainty melted away, replaced by pure, overwhelming love. He's perfect, Margaret said softly. Absolutely perfect. Richard Ashford appeared in the doorway, his head bandaged, but his eyes wide with wonder. When he saw his wife holding their son, he broke down completely, crossing the room in 2 strides to gather both of them in his arms. Victoria, I'm so sorry, he whispered. When I lost control of the car, I was so afraid I'd hurt you both. Richard, meet your son, Victoria said, her voice thick with emotion. And meet Margaret Whitlow, the angel who delivered him. Richard turned to Margaret, and she was struck by the intelligence and kindness in his eyes. Despite his expensive clothes and obvious wealth, there was nothing arrogant or entitled about him. Mrs. Whitlow, I don't know how to thank you. What you've done tonight. You don't need to thank me, Margaret interrupted gently. This is what neighbors do for each other. But we're not neighbors, Richard said. We're from Chicago. I'm in town on business, and Victoria insisted on coming with me even though she was so close to her due date. The storm caught us completely off guard. Margaret studied the man more closely. His suit, even rumpled and muddy, was clearly expensive. His watch caught the lamplight, and she could see it was gold. The car in the ditch, from what she'd seen of it, was the kind of vehicle that cost more than her family made in several years. What kind of business brings you to Nebraska? She asked, more out of politeness than curiosity. I'm a developer, Richard explained. I've been looking at agricultural properties throughout the Midwest. There's a lot of opportunity in farming. Operations, especially with new technologies coming online. Margaret nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure what he meant. Her own farming methods hadn't changed much since her father's time. They planted, tended, and harvested the same way. Generations of farmers had before them. The baby stirred in Victoria's arms, making small sounds that melted everyone's hearts. Samuel appeared with a cup of hot coffee for Richard and a bowl of warm soup for Victoria. The radio's working now, Samuel reported. I managed to get through. To the sheriff's office. They're sending an ambulance, but it might be a couple hours before they can get through. Some of the roads are completely washed out. We're not going anywhere in this storm anyway, Richard said. If it's not too much trouble, could we possibly stay until morning? Of course, Margaret said immediately. We wouldn't dream of sending you out in this weather with a newborn baby. As the night wore on, the storm gradually began to subside. Margaret helped Victoria with the baby's first feeding, showing her how to position him and offering gentle encouragement. The twins, initially awed by the presence of a newborn, gradually warmed up and began asking questions about the baby. What are you going to name him? Jacob asked, leaning over the back of the chair where Victoria was sitting. Victoria and Richard exchanged glances. We had been thinking about family names, Victoria said. But after tonight, after what Margaret has done for us, I think we'd like to name him after someone who represents kindness and generosity. What's your father's name, Mrs. Whitlow? Richard asked. My father was James, Margaret said, surprised by the question. James, Victoria repeated, testing the name. James Ashford. I like that. James, after the man who raised the woman who brought you into this world. Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. In all her 42 years, no one had ever honored her family in such a way. Her father had been a simple man, a farmer like Samuel, who had taught her that the measure of a person wasn't in what they owned, but in what they gave to others. The ambulance finally arrived just before dawn, but by then it was clear that both Victoria and baby James were doing well. The paramedics checked them both thoroughly and pronounced them healthy, though they recommended a trip to the hospital for a more complete examination. As Richard and Victoria prepared to leave, Richard pulled Margaret aside. Mrs. Whitlow, I want you to know that what you did tonight changed our lives. I also want you to know that if you ever need anything at all, you only have to ask. He pressed a business card into her hand. This has my personal phone number on it. I mean what I say. If there's ever anything I can do for you or your family, please don't hesitate to call. Margaret looked at the card. It was heavy, expensive cardstock with raised lettering. Richard Ashford, Ashford Development Corporation, Chicago, Illinois. That's very kind of you, Mr. Ashford, but we don't need anything. Seeing that beautiful baby come into the world safely is payment enough. Richard smiled, but there was something in his expression that suggested he wasn't entirely satisfied with her answer. Still, please keep the card. You never know what the future might bring. Victoria hugged Margaret tightly. The baby nestled between them. I'll never forget what you did for us, she whispered. Never. As the ambulance pulled away, followed by a tow truck that had come to retrieve Richard's car, Margaret stood in her doorway watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and fresh, and the corn in the fields sparkled with raindrops like tiny diamonds. Samuel came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. That was quite a night, he said. It was, Margaret agreed. Makes you think about how connected we all are, doesn't it? Those people could have been anyone, and somehow they ended up here, in our home, bringing new life into the world. You did good, Maggie, Samuel said, using the nickname he'd called her since they were teenagers. You always do good. Margaret leaned back against her husband's chest and watched the sun climb higher over their modest farm. She had no way of knowing that the baby she'd delivered that stormy night would grow up to become one of the most talented doctors in the Midwest. She couldn't foresee that young James Ashford would spend his childhood hearing the story of his birth, or that his parents would instill in him a deep respect for the woman who had brought him safely into the world. She certainly couldn't predict that exactly 20 years later, on another storm-filled autumn night, a young man in a white coat would knock on her door, ready to repay a debt of kindness that had shaped his entire life. All Margaret knew as she stood there in the doorway was that she had done what felt right, what her heart had told her to do. And sometimes, that's all any of us can do. Act with kindness when kindness is needed, and trust that somehow, somewhere, that kindness will find its way back into the world. Part 2. 20 years had a way of changing everything and nothing at the same time. The Whitlow farm looked much the same as it had the night James Ashford was born. The same weathered barn, the same cornfields stretching toward the horizon, the same sturdy farmhouse that had sheltered 3 generations of Margaret's family. But time had left its marks too. Margaret's hair, once a rich chestnut brown, was now completely silver, pulled back in the same simple bun she'd worn for decades. At 62, she moved a little slower than she used to, her hands bearing the permanent stains of soil and the calluses of hard work. Samuel's back bothered him more these days, especially when the weather was changing, and he'd begun talking about selling the farm and moving to town. The twins had grown up and moved away, as children do. Jacob had joined the army and was stationed in Germany, while Joshua had become a teacher and lived with his wife and 2 young children in Omaha. They visited when they could, but the farm felt emptier without their laughter filling the rooms. The farming had become harder too. Equipment was more expensive, regulations more complex, and the weather seemed more unpredictable every year. Margaret and Samuel had taken out a second mortgage on the farm 2 years earlier when a hailstorm had destroyed an entire season's worth of corn. They were making the payments, but just barely, and Margaret had started taking in sewing to help make ends meet. On this particular October evening, Margaret sat at her kitchen table working on a quilt for her grandson's birthday, her fingers moving with the practiced efficiency of a lifetime of needlework. The radio played softly in the background, offering weather reports that promised another storm system moving through the area overnight. Samuel was in his chair by the fireplace, reading a farming journal and occasionally commenting on an article about new irrigation techniques or crop rotation methods. It was a peaceful scene, the kind of quiet evening that had become precious to them in their later years. The knock on the door came just after 8 o'clock, firm but not urgent. Margaret looked up from her quilting, exchanging glances with Samuel. They weren't expecting anyone, and neighbors rarely visited this late. Without calling first, Samuel started to get up, but Margaret was already setting aside her sewing. "I'll get it," she said. "Probably just someone needing directions or a phone." She turned on the porch light and opened the door to find a young man standing in the gentle rain that had just begun to fall. He was tall and lean, with dark hair and kind eyes, wearing a white medical coat over dark slacks. Despite the weather, he carried himself with the confidence of someone comfortable in their own skin. "Mrs. Whitlow?" he asked, and something in his voice made Margaret's heart skip a beat. "Yes, I'm Margaret Whitlow. Can I help you?" The young man smiled, and in that smile, Margaret saw something achingly familiar, a warmth and intelligence, a gentleness that reminded her of someone, though she couldn't quite place who. "My name is Dr. James Ashford," he said. "I believe you knew my parents, Richard and Victoria Ashford. 20 years ago, on a night very much like this one, you delivered me in your home during a terrible storm." Margaret's hand flew to her throat, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. The baby she had brought into the world, the tiny life she had held in her hands on that unforgettable night, was standing before her as a grown man, a doctor. "James," she whispered. "Oh my goodness, James. Look at you." "May I come in?" he asked gently. "I have so much I want to say to you." Margaret stepped back immediately, ushering him into the warmth of the kitchen. Samuel looked up from his reading, and his eyes widened with recognition, even though he had only briefly seen the baby that night 2 decades ago. "Samuel, this is James Ashford," Margaret said, her voice still full of wonder. "The baby we delivered during the storm." Samuel set down his journal and stood, extending his hand to the young doctor. "Well, I'll be," he said. "James, you've grown up a bit since we last saw you." James laughed, shaking Samuel's hand warmly. "Just a bit. Dr. James Ashford now, actually. I graduated from Johns Hopkins Medical School 3 months ago and just started my residency in emergency medicine at the medical center in Lincoln." Margaret sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the moment. "I can't believe it. I mean, I always wondered what happened to you, how you grew up, but I never imagined. A doctor. Your parents must be so proud." James's expression grew tender. "They are. And they've never let me forget the story of my birth, Mrs. Whitlow. Growing up, whenever I faced a challenge or felt discouraged, my mother would tell me about the brave woman who delivered me during a storm, who opened her home to strangers. Without a second thought, she said you taught her what real strength looked like." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. "Your mother was the strong one that night. I just did what anyone would have done." "That's not true," James said, settling into the chair across from her. "Not everyone would have done what you did. Not everyone would have risked their own safety to help strangers, especially in those conditions. You probably saved both our lives that night." Samuel poured coffee for everyone, and as they sat around the kitchen table where Margaret had prepared countless family meals, James began to tell them about his life. He spoke of growing up in Chicago, of parents who had taught him the value of service and compassion. He described his father's business success and his mother's work with various charities. But most importantly, he talked about how the story of his birth had shaped his desire to become a doctor. "Every year on my birthday, my parents and I would make a donation to a rural health clinic somewhere in the Midwest," James explained. "Dad always said it was our way of honoring what you did for us, Mrs. Whitlow. But as I got older, I realized I wanted to do more than just write checks. I wanted to actually help people the way you help my family." Margaret listened with growing amazement as James described his academic achievements, his medical training, and his plans for his career. But what struck her most was his humility, his genuine warmth, and the way he spoke about using his skills to serve others. "Your parents raised a wonderful young man," she said finally. "They should be very proud." James's expression grew more serious. "Mrs. Whitlow, there's something else I need to tell you. The reason I'm here tonight isn't just to thank you, although I've wanted to do that for years. I'm here because I know you and Mr. Whitlow have been having some financial difficulties with the farm. Margaret and Samuel exchanged surprised glances. How could you possibly know that? Samuel asked. My father still has business interests in this area, James explained. When I told him I was moving to Nebraska for my residency, he started asking around about you. He learned about the hailstorm 2 years ago, about the second mortgage on the farm. He wanted to help, but he also knew you probably wouldn't accept charity. Margaret felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. Mr. Ashford, we're managing just fine. We don't need. Please, let me finish. James interrupted gently. This isn't charity, Mrs. Whitlow. This is family taking care of family. And whether you realize it or not, you've been part of our family since the night I was born. He reached into his coat and pulled out a thick envelope. My parents and I want to pay off the mortgage on your farm. All of it. We want you to own this land free and clear, with no debt hanging over your heads. Margaret stared at the envelope as if it contained something dangerous. We can't accept that. It's too much. We barely know each other. But that's where you're wrong, James said. I've known you my entire life, Mrs. Whitlow. Every story my parents told me about kindness, about doing what's right regardless of the cost, started with you. Every time I studied late into the night in medical school, when I was exhausted and ready to give up, I thought about a woman who didn't hesitate to help strangers in a storm. You've been my inspiration for 20 years. Samuel reached across the table and took Margaret's hand. Maggie, maybe we should listen to what the boy has to say. James smiled at being called a boy. There's more, he said. I'm going to be working at the medical center in Lincoln, but I know how hard it is for rural families to get medical care. I want to start a mobile clinic program that would bring basic medical services directly to farming communities like this one. I'd like to base the program here, if you'll let me. Margaret looked around her kitchen, imagining it transformed into a place where doctors and nurses would come to help their neighbors. Here, on our farm, we'd convert part of your barn into a clinic space, James explained. Nothing fancy, just a clean, well-equipped area where people could receive basic medical care, health screenings, vaccinations for their children. The program would pay you rent for the space, enough to cover your living expenses, and then some. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the mantel and the gentle patter of rain against the windows. Margaret felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what James was proposing. This is all happening so fast, she said finally. I need time to think. Of course, James said. I don't expect an answer tonight. But Mrs. Whitlow, I want you to understand something. This isn't about us doing you a favor. This would be you doing us a favor. You'd be helping me fulfill a dream I've had since I was old enough to understand what you did for my family. Margaret studied the young man's face, seeing in it echoes of the baby she had delivered so many years ago. There was something in his eyes that reminded her of that stormy night, a mixture of vulnerability and determination that touched her heart. Tell me about your parents, she said. How are they? James's face lit up. They're wonderful. Dad's business has done very well over the years, and he's been able to help a lot of farming families improve their operations. Mom has become very involved in literacy programs in Chicago. They both talk about you often, Mrs. Whitlow. In fact, they're hoping to visit next month if you'll have them. The thought of seeing Victoria and Richard again filled Margaret with unexpected joy. I'd love that, she said. I've thought about you all so many times over the years. James reached across the table and gently took her hand. Mrs. Whitlow, I want you to know that everything good in my life can be traced back to that night. The values my parents taught me, the inspiration to become a doctor, the desire to serve others, it all started with your kindness to strangers. Margaret looked at this remarkable young man and felt a profound sense of connection, as if the threads of fate that had brought him to her door as a baby had never really been broken. She thought about the struggles of the past few years, the worries about money and the farm, the uncertainty about the future. What would your mobile clinic do exactly? She asked. James's eyes brightened. We provide basic healthcare services to farming families who might not otherwise have easy access to medical care. routine checkups, vaccinations, treatment for minor injuries and illnesses. We'd also do health education programs, helping people understand how to prevent illness and when they need to seek more specialized care. And this would help families like ours. Families exactly like yours, James confirmed. Rural healthcare is one of the biggest challenges facing communities. Like this one. The nearest hospital is 30 miles away, and many families can't afford to take time off work to drive to Lincoln for routine medical care. This program would bring the care directly to them. Margaret glanced at Samuel, who nodded encouragingly. She could see in his eyes that he was as moved by this reunion as she was. James, she said slowly, I want you to know that delivering you was one of the most meaningful experiences of my life. I've helped birth many animals on this farm, and I was present when my own sons were born, but there was something special about that night. Something that felt like more than coincidence. I've always felt that too, James said. My parents say that from the time I was very small. Whenever they told me the story of my birth, I would insist that someday I was going to come back and help you the way you helped us. Margaret felt tears spilling down her cheeks. And here you are. Here I am, James agreed. Ready to help, if you'll let me. The storm outside was intensifying, and Margaret found herself thinking about another storm 20 years ago and how it had brought such unexpected blessings into her life. Sometimes, she realized, the things that seem like disasters at the time turn out to be the very events that lead to our greatest joys. Tell me more about this mobile clinic, she said, and James's smile told her that he knew she was seriously considering his proposal. They talked until well past midnight, sharing stories, dreams, and plans for the future. Margaret learned that James had specifically requested his residency placement in Nebraska so he could be near the place where his life began. She discovered that the Ashford family had quietly supported rural health initiatives throughout the Midwest for years, inspired by their experience with the Whitlows. Most importantly, she began to understand that this reunion wasn't really about repaying a debt. It was about family, the kind of family that isn't created by blood, but by love, kindness, and shared experience. It was about the mysterious ways that acts of compassion ripple through time, creating connections that endure across decades. As James prepared to leave, he hugged Margaret tightly. Thank you for listening, he said. And thank you for everything. Not just 20 years ago, but for the example you've set my entire life. Thank you for coming back, Margaret replied. I had no idea how much I needed to see the man you've become. After James drove away, Margaret and Samuel sat in their quiet kitchen, processing everything that had happened. The envelope containing the mortgage payoff still lay unopened on the table, but that seemed almost secondary to the emotional significance of the evening. What are you thinking, Maggie? Samuel asked. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, watching the rain streak down the windows. I'm thinking about how mysterious life is, she said finally. 20 years ago, we helped a stranger in a storm, never expecting anything in return. And now that stranger has grown up to become someone who wants to help us and our entire community. Are you going to accept his offer? Margaret picked up the envelope and held it carefully, as if it contained something precious rather than simply a financial instrument. I think I am, she said. Not because we need the money, although we do, but because I think this is how it's supposed to be. I think this is what my father would call coming full circle. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the farm that had been in her family for 3 generations. Tomorrow, she realized, everything might be different. Tomorrow, this might become a place where healing happened, where families received the medical care they needed, where another generation of children learned about kindness and service. Samuel, she said softly, I think we're about to start a new chapter. Samuel joined her at the window, wrapping his arms around her from behind. I think you're right, Maggie, and I think it's going to be a beautiful one. Outside, the storm began to subside, and through the clearing clouds, Margaret could see the first stars appearing in the night sky. 20 years ago, she had helped bring new life into the world. Tomorrow, in a different way, she would help bring new life to her community. The circle was indeed complete, But Margaret was beginning to understand that it wasn't really an ending at all. It was a beginning. Part 3. The transformation began slowly, like most profound changes do. Within a week of James's visit, the paperwork had been completed, and the Whitlow farm was officially debt-free for the first time in over a decade. Margaret kept staring at the deed, hardly believing that the weight of financial worry had been lifted from their shoulders so completely. But even more significant than the financial relief was the energy that James's proposal had brought to their lives. Samuel, who had been talking about retirement and moving to town, suddenly found himself sketching plans for converting the old dairy barn into a medical facility. Margaret discovered an enthusiasm she hadn't felt in years as she imagined their farm becoming a place of healing for their community. James visited twice more during the following weeks, bringing with him architects and medical equipment specialists who helped design the clinic space. The plans were modest but comprehensive: 3 examination rooms, a small laboratory for basic tests, a pharmacy area for essential medications, and a comfortable waiting room where families could gather. The renovation work began in November, with local contractors donating much of their labor and materials. Word had spread quickly through the farming community about what was happening at the Whitlow place, and the response was overwhelming. People who had known Margaret and Samuel for decades stepped forward to help, understanding instinctively that this clinic would serve their own families as well. During the construction, Richard and Victoria Ashford made their promised visit. Margaret had been nervous about seeing them again, wondering if wealth and success might have changed them. Her worries proved unfounded. Victoria, now a gracious woman in her early 50s, embraced Margaret like a long-lost sister. Richard, distinguished but still warm, shook Samuel's hand with genuine gratitude that had only deepened over the years. "Mrs. Whitlow," Victoria said as they sat in the same kitchen where James had been born, "I've thought about that night countless times over the past 20 years. Every time James achieved something significant, his first steps, his graduation from high school, his acceptance to medical school, I remembered that none of it would have been possible without you. And every time we heard about a rural family struggling to get medical care," Richard added, "we knew we had to do something." James's mobile clinic is the culmination of 2 decades of planning and dreaming. Margaret learned that the Ashfords had spent years researching rural healthcare needs, consulting with medical professionals, and studying the most effective ways to serve isolated communities. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment gesture of gratitude. It was a carefully planned initiative designed to make a real difference. "James has been passionate about this project since he was 12 years old," Victoria explained. "That's when he first told us he wanted to become a doctor so he could help people like you and Mr. Whitlow. We've been preparing for this day ever since." The clinic opened on a cold January morning, exactly 20 years and 3 months after James's birth. Margaret stood in the converted barn, watching as families from across the county arrived for their appointments. Children who had never received proper medical care were getting their first comprehensive checkups. Elderly farmers were finally able to address health concerns they'd been ignoring for years due to distance and cost. James moved between examination rooms with the confidence of someone who had found his true calling. When he caught Margaret's eye, he smiled and mouthed, "Thank you." But they both knew the gratitude flowed both ways. As Margaret watched him work, she understood that sometimes the greatest gifts we give come back to us transformed, multiplied, and more beautiful than we ever imagined possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.